Hey everyone, this is David Wolinsky back with another interview from the audio archives of no-don't-die.com. This time I'm bringing to you the first half of my Q&A with Jesper Juul, who's a video game theorist out in Copenhagen. He and I spoke on December 4th, 2017, and if you'd like to read transcripts of other interviews I've done, please hop on over to no-don't-die.com. Also down below you'll see some links to my Patreon if you'd like to support this work that I'm doing. Thanks, and now here's Jesper Juul.
Okay. Yeah, so my name is Jesper Juul. So I'll usually say that I'm a video game theorist. And so right now I'm in Copenhagen, where I'm originally from or whereabouts. And I've been working with video game theory roughly since 1998, so coming up to almost 20 years. And so my relation to the game industry and to games is that at least for a period of time, especially like the late 1990s, I was working a lot with, say, online multiplayer games in browsers. And then I was perhaps getting slightly tired at the time of just making games. And so I was also kind of trying to finish my studies at the university. And then I realized I could actually kind of write theory about video games. And so through no kind of particular planning of mine, that I became the kind of person who writes books about video games. and so like I've been interested in things like, the nature of kind of rules and storytelling in my first book, the changing audience for video games in my second book, A Casual Revolution. And then in my latest book, The Art of Failure, I've been interested in the question of like how it is that we play video games, even though they seem to make us, or at least me, kind of very unhappy a lot of the time when we fail or when we lose. So those are the kind of questions I'm kind of interested in. And right now I'm writing a book about independent video games. And so I both worked in Copenhagen, also a bit at the New York University Game Center and at MIT, the Comparative Media Studies / writing program, where I'm also still a visiting associate professor. And now I'm at the Royal Danish Academy of Fine Arts School of Design in Copenhagen is my main job. And so I run a kind of video game program here in game design with a kind of visual angle, and then kind of I write and do my research and these sort of things. So you can say I'm not like an industry person, but I don't really write books about how to make video games, but I tend to see myself as someone who's kind of you say practice compatible, so that I know a lot of people who make games, and I try to be informed by what's actually kind of happening. And so I'm not going to tell you how to make more money making a video game, but like hopefully the stuff I do can help people kind of conceptualize or think about what they're doing in better ways.
Mm-hmm. And this is a sort of a mundane follow-up, but this is something I ask of everyone if you're comfortable giving it. I feel like maybe you already said this in a way, but how old are you?
I'm 47.
Gotcha. So you've been doing this for a significant portion of your life
Yeah,
now.
that's true. Yeah.
Yeah, which as have I. So I mentioned, just a lot of the stuff that I'm interested in talking to you about is through the lens of this book, A Casual Revolution, which came out in 2010, I believe.
Yeah.
So this is kind of very broad. I want to ask about the subtitle here, which is, reinventing video games and their players.
Yeah.
How many reinventions of games and their players have you sort of noticed there have been since the dawn of gaming? Because, do you feel like casual was the first reinvention, or have there been others?
It's an excellent question. You can always posit these kind of radical breaks in history. So it always depends on like how much what you mean has to count for reinvention. I think it's more that perhaps that there are various aspects of games that get reinvented at different times. And so this is also, I guess, sometimes you hear this question about like, is the video game like an adolescent, or when do video games get their first Citizen Kane, or say are video games, are we in the 1910s compared to movies, the 1930s or whatever? And I think most of these times those questions actually, they don't actually work, because it's not like things don't actually arrive. So it's more that there may be kind of short periods of time where things seem stable, and then they tend to break apart again. So there's no kind of finally coming in of age, maturing, getting there, I don't think, for anything really. And so for video games, yeah, it's true if you can pass it a few breaks. So I still think like from going to arcade to kind of home playing was really important. I don't think the crash was that important, because it mostly happened in the US, not really in the rest of the world. Um, and then I think, of course, online is a kind of break, but it's also refers to things that happened before, say, on university networks and mods and so on. But I do think kind of the reason casual, I think, is so interesting is that it at least refers to this kind of thing that the industry had become kind of very focused on only selling kind of very large games in boxes, which would have to be sold on kind of increasingly kind of photorealistic or realistic graphics, whatever that means. And then suddenly you can say the rise of casual games was a break in terms of kind of realizing that video games weren't just marching into that kind of future where things would just become more and more complex and involved and look much more like the real thing, or like cinema at least. So I think in that sense, it's a pretty kind of radical break.
Well, this is another question that's probably doesn't have an answer, but I mean, if we're hoping to reinvent games, I mean, what do you sort of see as their utopia? I mean, is it like unlatching them from the design principles we consider fundamental today, or is it just thinking about them in a different way completely?
Oh, interesting.
And you don't have to adhere to that binary, but that's just sort of what I thought.
Well, it's a bit more. Yeah, I was just reading this, like, again, going back to what we said just before, reading this article about film history, which argues that, and this is kind of a common argument, film had been kind of born twice, so that at first there was a technology, and then later you recognized film as this kind of cultural form with its own conventions and so on. And so you can say, again, I think the idea of the utopia is a bit of the same, that there might be some way of kind of arriving, right? That there'd be some way at which point it was fixed. And I do think what happens is actually kind of something else, right? Which is that we tend to, for periods of time, think that we know what video games are, right? So we felt we knew what video games were when there were these things you'd buy in a box, and there was this kind of 25 year where that was the kind of dominant model. And then what rather happens is just that video games always change in ways we hadn't predicted, right? So casual games kind of felt unpredictable, that it wasn't something people had thought would happen. And I think the same thing with kind of indie games. And so perhaps why I don't like the idea of the utopia is more like this idea. It sounds like this idea that we'd finally kind of get there in some way. And so I think it's just perhaps more that just to realize that games will continue to change, and one of the reasons they will continue to change is that human culture also changes, and that humans, unlike things like atoms and molecules, actually get tired of things, right? So in a way, we also always want to make, in a way, be scientific about games, and I have absolutely nothing against trying to do that, but it's just that, well, humans get bored of things, and things fall in and out of fashion. So you can't quite think of it that way. And so if I wanted to say one thing that's my kind of utopia, in a way, it's just I'd kind of hope that people would get away from this idea that they'd find the kind of final game, which kind of is the perfect game, which kind of solves everything, either from a kind of monetary standpoint or even from a kind of political standpoint, right? So I think we tend to have, and this is also very clear in independent games, this idea that, say, like, all the previous games were wrong or faulty in some way, and now we'll finally make this new game that is the kind of the final answer to the ultimate question about games. And
Yeah.
I think it's just important to realize that I think that's the wrong way to think about it. Okay.
Yeah, it's funny because you mentioned these different ways that you perceive people are trying to quote unquote solve
Mm,
games, and something that someone I'd interviewed previously, and something I still think about maybe once a week, is there's this sort of unspoken attitude that games are trying to solve genres, which is
yeah.
I think a little bit of what you're saying. Um, so to completely flip that from my previous question, I mean, how do you think the importance of video games it has been overstated? Like I know in our emails you said that from way back when you said quote, we are way too obsessed with the status of video games. People aren't as defensive about books.
Yeah, yeah, it's true. Yeah, I mean, I think that ties to in a way, the utopia question, right? Again, we want to kind of arrive and finally have our kind of hobbies be accepted into the pantheon of kind of great art, and that's again not necessarily a particularly kind of amazing goal to strive for. Yes,
No, I mean even through
yeah.
the frame of this is something I still hear. I don't remember the first time I heard this. Games are bigger than Hollywood. I mean, if you look at the spreadsheets for that, it's based on some faulty math, and I think these days,
It's usually box office, right? Isn't that the
yes, yeah, and I don't even think that like culturally, Hollywood is something to like be envious of or to necessarily emulate.
Yeah, but I mean, I think what's one of the things about that's interesting about games is that they're always kind of weirdly embedded in all kinds of stuff we do, right? So it's not. I mean, I do think you can analyze a video game, and I'm very much into that. But video games are also kind of enmeshed in our lives in kind of crazy ways, and so that makes some of those kind of arguments about kind of trying to make, say, video games into art, for example, it makes them kind of weird, right? Because video games in a way are always like have always been like art that's broken out of its frame. It's always been in a kind of, it's much more like kind of avant-garde art than ever was like kind of you have painting, right? So I think that the order of things is just always kind of very reversed and
Yeah.
kind of backwards.
Well, and I think weird is a good word for it. And one of the things I really liked about this book that I'm primarily going to be focusing on is you take a look at the audience and sort of the way that these boundaries have sort of calcified, and I think a lot of things that have caused tension in the years since then is just this sort of miscommunication about needing to come to this consensus about what games are and who games are
Mm.
for. And in your research for that book or other books you've done since, or your other research in general, I mean, what do you feel gets lost in translation when people try to explain their love for video games or recommend them to people who don't already play? Like, what do you think they fail to
I mean,
communicate?
so because the obvious miscommunication is often about, yeah, so say people who he may have, say, like deep knowledge of specific genre or video game tropes, and then try to kind of sell or promote games to their kind of non-player friends. But it turns out the games actually kind of only work if you have that deep knowledge. So people get kind of turned off. Or in a way, a game like that, a complex game, may be kind of impenetrable to someone who's not really into games. And I just even remember, like, back when Portal came out, so everybody loved Portal. I still think it's an amazing game, but then it turned out like people who weren't into video games couldn't actually play it. They found, like, I've seen a lot of people try to play it and completely fail because it's just most non-gamers find it very difficult to control like a person in a 3D space, right? And so that's in ways the simplest version of that. I kind of start another version of that is just, well, games which turn out to have huge time investments. And that's one of the things I talk about in the book, that a lot of people
Mm-hmm.
don't play, just don't have the time, or they don't have the time, the kinds of chunks that a lot of games are actually built around. And so that's another kind of flaw. Uh, and also, I think more recently that there's this kind of interesting stuff for kind of more independent and experimental games, which I think it's supposed to have this idea that you'd also in a way break out of the confines of like the AAA mainstream game, and now you'd finally like you have a game so kind of by the people for the people. I think that there is this idea sometimes in indie games, and then often, or at least sometimes, it just turns out that the more experimental games may actually be even harder to pass for people who are non-gamers, or they may be like very hard to pass, but also require that you have at least a BA in the humanities to be able to kind of figure out what's going on. And in a way, that's fine with me. I have an MA and a PhD and so on, so I enjoy that sort of thing. But I think I can also see that how it ends up kind of rejecting people, right? Because you just keep like adding up the list of things you're supposed to know already.
Yeah, I mean, why? This is another sort of narrative that I've heard maybe as long as the games are bigger than Hollywood thing, which is this games have one narrative, which I think is sort of linked in with that Hollywood stuff, but just that like, everyone's playing games now, which I think ties into the casual stuff. But I mean, why do you think that games have one narrative persists if it's still alienating people, or the medium itself still, is a turnoff to many more people than probably the people who do play?
But well, I don't think the medium, whatever how we construct it, is a turn off by now. I think when I wrote the book, I think we're still getting to this point where it was becoming sort of common for people to play video games, but then since gaming moved on to phones, I think you would say that battle for the hearts and minds of the majority of the population kind of has won. I think it's more than now you have a lot of people from the game industry or even academics too, and I think a lot of my students kind of don't feel comfortable or look down upon the games that the kind of the mass market play. Like typically people hate, say, Candy Crush or something like this, and they feel that in a way like your aunt or your grandparents are being tricked if they're playing Candy Crush, right? And so I feel that it ends up becoming in a way a kind of mirroring of the kind of prejudices that the outside world tended to have, a general culture tended to have against video games, like this idea that they're just in it for the money, they're exploitative, they're just kind of sucking people's souls. And now I think a lot of kind of game culture has taken all of those prejudices and then turned it against, say, like mobile games instead. So I tend to have this joke that say like kind of a lot of casual games or social games are in a way the video games of video games, right? They have the status in video game culture that video games had in culture at large. So because so people just end up reproducing like some prejudices that they kind of be exposed to themselves. So I know I'm kind of shifting compared to your questions. I hope that's fine.
Oh, that's okay. Well, that's the nature of these conversations in general. I mean, this was another thing that we had emailed about more recently. I think it was either from I think it was yeah, it was the Henry Lowood thing when I reached out to you. But I had another conversation with Harold Jenkins, which is a name I'm guessing you would recognize. Sure. Do you? Yeah, I met with him too when I was out in California, and he said, because I think a lot of what we're talking about, like if we talk about hardcore and casual, and is gaming still alienating to people, quote unquote, outside of it? It's hard to quantify or to like zero in on like how do you determine like what the mainstream's awareness even is of games, like, and how do you even define that? And I think after I emailed you, I had a conversation with Harold Jenkins. And he told me maybe as someone outside the U.S. you have a different perspective, but he said the way to look at it is to think of what Entertainment Weekly covers, because they cover books, movies, TV, and even Broadway, but not games. So I mean, as someone outside of the U.S. and someone who has done a lot of thinking about this, I mean, how do you track where the divide is today of as far as like what what most people know about video games versus what the smallest groups of people know about video games?
But well, I think in most studies I've seen recently in kind of rich Western countries, you'd see that and more than 50% of the population reports playing digital games. So that's the. I mean, there's some reason to actually say that most people play video games. That there are studies that support this. So I don't necessarily think like of course if it's done by the ESA, of course they have some kind of vested interest in those kind of results. But I do think you see something similar in other situations. But I actually think that, and I think this is one of my also, I think which is pretty important, is that games are also becoming kind of normal in that sense, right? That we still have kind of vestiges of this idea that, yes, we talked about that one should always defend games, like all games in a general abstract sense. But I do think video games is just becoming also much more like other kind of art forms of fields, in that, well, you just have some people like one thing, some people like another, and they kind of disagree and think the other people are stupid, right? And so that's a healthy sign in many ways, right? That just video games are becoming so large that one is not just into video games, but might into perhaps a specific subset or played on a particular platform or something like that. And I mean, I think the students I talk to will often say that they don't like free-to-play games or microtransactions, for example. So that's often a very kind of strong kind of identity thing about being against that, even though it turns out they're actually playing them and sometimes paying anyway. But it's more like you're kind of supposed to feel that if you're a particular kind of person, and then a lot of people don't actually mind. So I think it's just becoming more normal and kind of in its fragmentation. Even though we don't necessarily kind of acknowledge that when we talk about video games at large.
That it's becoming more mainstream, but also more
fragmented. I mean, so that becoming fragmented is part of becoming mainstream, right? And so
because so many different groups are embracing it and adopting it and have their own interpretations.
Yeah, exactly. And then also then you have to in its start, you can no longer differentiate yourself by playing video games. So you have to differentiate yourself by playing certain video games, and so. And so then you get all these online wars or disagreements about people, or you get, say, like more kind of sophisticated independent games, which are also kind of meant to be kind of inaccessible to lay people. That's kind of part of the charm, right?
Mm-hmm. Well, and to go back, I mean, I asked you this about people who love games, sort of what gets lost in translation for them. I know for your book you also talked to a number of people who stopped playing, or maybe stopped playing and even picked them back up. I mean, this is honestly something probably we could do an entire interview about alone, because I've talked to a fair amount of people who match that description. What do you think gets lost in translation when they try to explain why they stopped, or do you think people even actually understand themselves why they stopped when they talk about it?
Yeah, I mean, to some extent. So I mean, we don't necessarily do these things as this kind of. It's not like we do spreadsheets where we kind of weigh the pros and cons, but certainly that might be certainly on a kind of practical level. Again, the question of time is the one that always comes up. That a lot of the games we have tended to kind of value, both in the game industry and also in academia, are games that are pretty time intensive. So they might be just like if a game takes 40 or 60 hours to play, for a lot of people that's going to become an issue. If you can only play a game in like 1 hour chunks to be able to actually make any progress, that's an issue. And also if you can only, in a way, a lot of games don't necessarily give you a clear idea of how long a game session is going to be, right? So if you have a life where you easily become interrupted, so say if you have kids, or say perhaps you're playing at work and you kind of shouldn't, then it doesn't really work if you don't know like how long the game session is going to be, or if kind of interrupting you is going to kind of break the whole kind of game for you. And so I think this is perhaps one of the reasons for casual games, and also very general for like shorter and shorter play sessions. So I have a Clash Royale addiction right now, and the point is like all games are like 4 minutes max, but it gives me I think I get a lot of pleasure out of that. But the chunks are actually sufficiently short I can do it in a quick break, and then if I really need to go, I can actually leave the game. I'll lose perhaps like kind of 30 points, but it'll be fine. And so I think that's a lot of that's a lot of what happens is just a time issue. And then also again, perhaps like getting tired of things, right? So people do probably kind of pop in and out of video games. So sometimes they'll find something interesting for a brief period of time. Say perhaps some people love music games, and then they get tired of music games. The whole culture actually became kind of tired of music games. Music games fell out of fashion, and then they might kind of pop back into kind of video games some years later when they see something that interests them. So still the practical issue is probably the biggest one of just not having enough time. And then, I mean, secondly, if you don't necessarily define yourself as a gamer, you'll just probably just kind of come to games when you find something interesting and then leave them again. And for us people who work in games, that's kind of shocking, obviously, but I think that's how it works for most people.
Do you think the game industry, I mean, I've sort of jokingly said that video games are kind of like, I guess maybe The Simpsons or Weird Al or Saturday Night Live, and that I think like when you were 12 is when you think they were at their best.
Sure, yeah.
And then you know I've talked a lot about this thing of people aging out of games. That sort of was the way I started talking about it, which is either, you know, the games coming out aren't appealing to them anymore, or they do have these other responsibilities. But I've also come across this other demographic, which is people who describe themselves as having never aged into games. And this is something like you were saying with the stuff with Portal. But I have had people tell me that they feel like a poser because they don't play the right games. But they don't see this happen in TV, where people treat you like you're not a real TV fan if you don't like the popular TV shows. I don't know.
Yeah.
Where does that sort of where do you think that comes from of trying to make other people who enjoy the same activity as you are somehow you know, they're inferior, or they don't belong, or they should be ridiculed and sort of chased away? Where does that come from in game culture?
Oh, that's super interesting. Yeah, but it's true. I think there's, I mean, part of it probably just, I do think that a lot of people who've been in video games still have this feeling of being kind of under attack, I guess. Even, and I think some people will say that this is kind of wrong, but that there's this idea that if you played video games, you've just always been criticized, and there've been kind of congressional hearings to try to shut your kind of favorite medium down, and then people are perhaps like still kind of reacting if that's kind of constantly the case. And and then again, as I said, that creates this kind of idea of the kind of purity, that there's kind of one kind of true game. And I do think people, and this is just everybody does that, right? So people who don't play kind of large AAA games tend to look down on those. People who play large AAA games look down on kind of indie games for being too weird, and casual games for being too simple. The people who play casual games look down on indie games for being too weird, mainstream games being too violent and big, and so on. I think you do have these kind of three poles, which is just constantly criticizing each other and kind of believing themselves to be the kind of the kind of true game. It's an interesting, there's probably a stronger idea of the kind of purity or the real game in game culture than anywhere else. And I do think part of it is that history of feeling under attack.
How much of it do you think comes from the West's influence, or sort of the West's adoption and getting into video games? Like, I mean, this is very hypothetical, but I mean, was there anything like this when video games were just in Japan?
Oh, interesting.
I mean, we're talking pre-internet, a lot of other things here.
I don't really know. That's an excellent question.
Oh, that's okay.
Yeah, I mean, so I'd say usually you'd say the history of up to like, I guess perhaps like early 90s, the history in the different regions are kind of different, right? So in Europe we had much longer period of time which was like home computer only, And
Right.
consoles actually became a factor like only with say like the PlayStation 1, or at least like a major factor. So the home computer industry
Yes.
continued like a much longer time than it did in the US. This is also why there wasn't a crash, because people didn't really have like Atari 2600s on a major scale. And so this also means that game culture was slightly more tied to kind of tech or hacker culture for a long period of time, where perhaps in the US it earlier became more of a kind of tied to kind of entertainment industry. And so that
Hmm.
also means that perhaps the language for talking about games was kind of slightly different. So it was a lot more based on kind of copying stuff and sharing it in Europe for a long period of time. And so I guess that was, I wouldn't say people were always less skeptical to video games in Europe, but perhaps in the big picture, and I think part of it was probably because there was some perceived kind of healthiness in video games. They were tired you'd kind of at least kind of learn something with to use a computer, and that might get you a job in the end. And this is always like harder to make the case for if you played with a console. Yeah, so I
Right.
think
Because they're closed
yeah.
systems. Yeah.
But actually, one thing I think that's interesting in this discussion is that you realize that video games are off the hook now, right? That
As far
as far
as
as being like the kind of
as
public enemy number one. So because now that's social
yes.
media, right? And so this
Yeah.
happened. I'm
Yeah.
not even sure, like five
Uh,
years ago or something. Suddenly, and even now, like even it's become even worse now, right? So I mean, nobody's is worrying about like
I've
video
heard, yes.
games.
I've heard a little bit
Yeah,
about
right. So
it.
it's
But
just switched,
but
right?
I
Like
mean,
it's
but
not us anymore, and you
yeah,
can't get used to it.
and 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 yet, I mean, they do of course overlap. And I think what's funny and unexpected is that I mean, if you had grown up with games as you and I did, and certainly you would have thought it was absurd to think that one of the most popular cultural forms of today is to watch other people play
Hmm.
games, and that there's this expectation that people have to sort of to basically support themselves playing video games. So using somebody else's creation, posting videos on a platform they don't own, they still expect to be able to support themselves or to create a living, which I guess is sort of a way of normalizing video games, but I think it makes it seem much stranger.
But but this is what I
to
mean.
the Yeah.
But I think that goes to the kind of entertainment weekly question. My kind of guess would be that more people watch YouTube than read Entertainment Weekly, by a very
Oh,
by
I
a
would
very
agree. I
very
would
very
agree.
large factor.
I'm sure the traffic on YouTube is
Yeah,
much better.
and 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 so that's also like I also have kids, and I think it's kind of clear for them at least like YouTube is the thing, right? So that's where things happen. That's where ideas get spread, and a lot of video
Yeah.
games are very strongly present on YouTube, which may not actually be anywhere. So I think a lot of the most popular kind of YouTube personalities are actually working with games, and so I think that says something very real about kind of cultural reach.
Well, or at least the demographics of YouTube.
Yeah, I guess so too. But
Yeah, I mean it's complicated, but yeah, I would agree
but
with you.
so I read there's a game called Stick Fight the Game. So it's this kind of very small fighting game which actually I think sold really well. I saw a talk with them, and they talked about this weird thing that for the different games, it's a company called Landfall Games, that they try to track like how much traffic or sales they would get from different kind of kind of PR channels, and then they'd get like become written up on IGN, and then they saw there would be like 10 retweets or something, right? And then somebody would post on YouTube, and there'd be like thousands. And so their feeling was just at like even in their space that even like game reviews had ceased to actually matter. So everything to them was just kind of YouTube streamers.
Hmm. Did you say that you did already interview Jason
Yeah,
Roy, or
I
you were
did.
about to? Yeah, I don't know. I mean, I'm not assuming that you read my interview with him, but we that's something we
Oh,
talked
really?
about, which was uh, just in his position making what I don't even know if we still call them quote unquote art games anymore. But he was saying that, like, he can get written up in all of these very old school mainstream places like NPR and et cetera, et cetera. And it doesn't really rate. Like, people won't click through. Like, they might read about them, but they certainly won't buy them. But like, what is the most useful for someone like him is when a Kotaku writes
Mm.
about him. But what's funny, and I'm sure this is another name you recognize, but when I interviewed Liz
Yeah.
Ryerson, she told me that she feels like uh, games writers, even people who professionally, have jobs writing about games, they don't want to write about these art games. Uh, I don't know. It's just there are all these weird contrasting uh, channels that these games have to getting noticed. I mean, have you sensed that
It depends on what kind of writer you are, right? So certainly,
yeah, but I
so,
think but I mean, yeah, go ahead. I'm sorry.
yeah. So I've been looking at kind of various kind of indie and experimental games, and I think you can certainly see there's some kind of review tropes there that are for people who, in a way, like to pick up a kind of very experimental game and in a way like
Yeah.
compare it to like to kind of poetry or to kind of French New Wave, and so these kind of people
Mm-hmm.
obviously love to write about kind of art games. So
Yeah.
because for them it kind of activates this whole kind of cultural capital, this kind of vocabulary that this kind of highbrow, middlebrow vocabulary. I think for those it's interesting. And then you can say like if you write for USA Today, perhaps like not so much. And then
Yeah.
yeah, I think it's a little more complicated than that. I think for I think kind of experimental games have been served very well for a period of time by certain kind of journalists who wanted to write about kind of extreme experiments and who wanted to talk about like you think video games is X, but they can also be Y, and they can talk about personal experiences. And you can say perhaps some of the news value of that may be kind of dying out, but I think for a period of time kind of that worked. And I also
Yeah.
think that perhaps weird video games in a kind of very broad sense have been served very well by YouTube. And I think this is kind of unusual, right? That you can't really do music. It's very hard to do music, or it's very at least uncommon to do music or theater these days, where it's so weird that people will write about it or stream about it, right? It's not really doesn't happen every day, right? But it does seem to be something that's happening a lot for a lot of experimental games, at least for a period of time. That a game like Quap by Bennett Foddy suddenly in a way became
Yeah.
popular through YouTube, and this game Stick Fight, the game that I talked about, also in a way became popular because it's so goofy and looks so funny. Or Goat Simulator, or what was this game called I Am Bread, which came
Oh
recently,
yeah,
which were
sure.
like all of the there's all these reviews of it saying in this game you are a piece of bread. Isn't that weird, right? And that was enough for journalists to actually kind of even kind of get the headline in, right?